Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before everything changed. That is what he said before the machine started screaming. Before the room went dead silent. Before a nurse nobody knew was a decorated combat veteran walked into the light. Hannah Clarke's first week at St. Michael's Hospital in Philadelphia unfolded under fluorescent lights that hummed like distant aircraft, a sound she'd learned to ignore 5 years ago in the mountains of Helmand Province. The night shift suited her. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. The antiseptic smell burned her nostrils with every breath, sharp and chemical, nothing like the dust and diesel of forward operating bases, but her hands knew what to do. Check the 4. Read the monitor. Note the pressure. Move to the next bed. She kept her head down the way trained operatives do, the kind of quiet competence that made most people overlook her entirely, which was exactly how naval intelligence needed it. On her third night, Hannah sat in the staff lounge at 2:17 a.m., watching the fluorescent light flicker above the coffee station. The room smelled like stale coffee and someone's microwaved salmon from 6 hours prior. She'd been assigned to St. Michael's for surveillance purposes, though the mission parameters were precise: monitor the recovery of Commander James Reeves in ICU room 347. Watch for signs of the experimental neurotoxin suspected in his injury. Maintain her cover. Report only through encrypted channels. Do not blow your identity. That was the standing order. But as she sat alone, truly alone, she noticed the pharmaceutical logs on the shelf beside the coffee maker. Inventory ledgers. Patient charts stacked loosely. She stood with her cup still warm in one hand and reached for the binder. Morphine counts didn't match supply orders. Fentanyl patches ordered in quantities that implied patient census 3 times what the hospital actually held. She photographed 2 pages with her phone. The camera clicked the only sound in the empty lounge. The discrepancies formed a pattern she recognized from her 17 years reading tactical intelligence. Someone was stealing. Someone was systematic. Someone was careful. Dr. Caldwell entered through the side door at 2:24 a.m., and Hannah didn't flinch. She closed the binder with a deliberate motion, not hurried, not defensive, and turned to face him with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive watch that caught the fluorescent light. His eyes narrowed. They tracked from her face to the pharmaceutical logs to her hand still resting on the binder. For exactly 3 seconds, neither of them moved. He smiled then, the kind of smile that predators show when they've identified a threat in the watering hole. Reading up on our supply chain. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, dangerous, barely contained power. Hannah met his gaze without blinking. Thought I'd understand the ICU better. She kept her voice deferential, soft. Just a new nurse asking innocent questions. His eyes didn't leave her face. Don't. Not a suggestion. A command. He moved past her to pour his own coffee, his shoulder deliberately brushing against hers, not an accident. A message. In military circles, that kind of proximity invasion meant dominance assertion. Challenge established. He'd been manipulating the pharmaceutical logs for 18 months, skimming inventory through a medical supply company he'd partnered with. The kickbacks paid for his gambling debts, Atlantic City, online poker, a blackjack habit he couldn't break. He'd already moved $47,000 through the scheme. He had no idea Hannah had photographed those pages. He had no idea she'd been trained to recognize financial crime patterns. He had no idea she'd already reported the discrepancies to her handler via encrypted dead drop. What he did know was that this quiet new nurse was asking the wrong questions. What he did know was that she'd become a problem. The next morning, Hannah arrived at St. Michael's at 6:45 p.m. for her night shift, her civilian scrubs hiding the faded unit patch sewn into the jacket lining underneath, proof of identity only she could see. The ER was controlled chaos, that particular organized emergency that belongs to the graveyard shift. A stabbing victim in Trauma Bay 3. A cardiac patient in the catheterization lab. She passed through security with her new badge, clipped to her collar, and made her way to the ICU. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure, a digital symphony she'd learned to read in field hospitals where the equipment was salvaged and the stakes were permanent. Room 347 was on the north wing, fourth bed from the nurse's station. She arrived at 7:03 p.m. and stopped in the doorway, her hand instinctively reaching for the coin in her pocket. Commander James Reeves lay sedated in the hospital bed, his left arm resting above the blanket. The tattoo was visible from 12 feet away, 2 words in elegant black script running down the inside of his forearm. Hannah, Angel of Bagram. Her jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, but her hands remained steady as she approached the bed and checked his vitals. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 64 and regular. O2 saturation 98%. All stable. His eyes opened briefly, the pupils dilated from the morphine drip, and he stared directly at her without recognition. For 6 full seconds, his gaze held hers. Then his eyes closed again, drifting back into the pharmacological darkness where traumatic brain injury had sent him 3 months ago near Bagram Air Base. She touched the challenge coin in her pocket, worn smooth, tarnished from 5 years of carrying it, and left the room without letting anyone see her face. The mission parameters had been clear when Naval Intelligence placed her here: monitor Reeves's recovery for signs of the neurotoxin. Watch his cognitive function. Flag any unusual symptoms. Maintain her nursing cover completely. She wasn't supposed to connect with him. Wasn't supposed to let emotion compromise the operation. Wasn't supposed to remember pulling his body from a burning Humvee with rounds still incoming, carrying 210 pounds of commander through 340 yards of hostile fire while his blood soaked through her uniform. Wasn't supposed to recall the moment he'd given her this coin in the helicopter, his last conscious act before the sedation, telling her she was the bravest warrior he'd ever known. She logged his vitals at the nurse's station, her documentation precise and emotionless. She was about to move to the next room when Dr. Caldwell appeared beside her, his presence making the air pressure change. He looked at the chart in her hands. Room 347 is stable, she said. Good vitals. No concerns. He nodded slowly, his eyes moving from her face to the patient list to the pharmaceutical cabinet visible through the glass partition. Stay away from the supply logistics. Understand? You're new. You don't know how things work here. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She nodded, playing the part of the compliant new hire. Yes, doctor. She moved away from him toward the next patient, but she felt his gaze follow her down the corridor. He'd marked her as a threat. He'd made it clear that he was willing to use his position against her. He didn't yet understand that she'd survived Kandahar province, survived ambushes that killed 13 of her teammates, survived carrying a bullet in her shoulder because the mission came first. A surgeon's arrogance was nothing compared to the calculus of actual combat. An hour passed. The monitors beeped. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The night shift rolled forward with the quiet competence of people who'd learned to function when most of the world slept. Hannah moved between rooms, checking fours, adjusting drips, noting subtle changes in vital signs. She was good at this. Nursing had come naturally because combat medicine had taught her to think in terms of triage, survival, the mathematics of who could be saved. At 8:16 p.m., she passed room 347 again. Commander Reeves's eyes were open, and he was staring at the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of someone lost inside their own damaged neural pathways. She didn't stop. Stopping would draw attention. The fewer people who noticed how she cared for this particular patient, the better. She moved to room 351 and continued her rounds, her hand steady, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing he was lying in that bed, alive because of her, unable to remember the woman who'd saved his life. The worst part was watching him suffer and being unable to do anything but monitor his vitals and wait for his brain to heal itself. The worst part was Dr. Caldwell's presence at the nurse's station, reviewing pharmaceutical logs, making notes, his eyes occasionally drifting toward room 347 as if calculating probabilities. Hannah understood threat assessment the way civilians understood breathing. She saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, what this nurse knew, what she might do with that knowledge, how best to eliminate the risk she represented to his carefully constructed criminal scheme. He was strategic. That made him more dangerous than simple cruelty. That made him someone who planned his moves carefully, deployed his resources precisely, and didn't act without calculating the angles. She'd come to St. Michael's to observe one injured commander. She'd walked into the middle of institutional corruption orchestrated by a man who had access to patient files, medication supplies, and enough leverage with hospital administration to destroy careers. The ticking clock had already started. She just didn't know it yet. The cafeteria at St. Michael's hummed with the lunch-hour chaos of 100 conversations layered over the clinking of trays and the mechanical wheeze of the soda machine in the corner. Hannah Clarke sat alone at a corner table, cutting her turkey sandwich into precise quarters the way she'd been taught to portion field rations 23 years ago. 12 nurses and 4 doctors occupied the surrounding tables, the kind of crowd where nobody paid attention to the new night shift hire keeping her head down and moving quietly through the kitchen line. Dr. Caldwell entered from the administrative corridor at 12:17 p.m., his white coat immaculate, his presence the kind that made the air pressure change. He scanned the cafeteria like a predator identifying prey, then locked onto Hannah's table. What she didn't know was that he'd been watching her for 6 days, watching her ask questions about pharmaceutical inventory logs, watching her linger over the supply chain documentation, watching her eyes move across records he'd spent 18 months carefully manipulating to siphon $847,000 in kickbacks from a medical supply company called Mercer Clinical Solutions. Well. His voice cut across the room like a blade. The new girl actually takes breaks. Hannah's hands continued their work, knife moving through bread with mechanical precision. She didn't look up. Tell me, sweetheart, did you even finish nursing school or did they just hand you a diploma for showing up? Caldwell's laugh was a bark, designed to draw attention, designed to establish dominance. The surrounding tables quieted. Fawkes paused mid-bite. Her jaw clenched once, barely perceptible, a twitch of muscle at the hinge. But her hands remained steady as she set down her knife, one deliberate motion, and met his eyes with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing of the person she actually was. No tremor. No heat rising in her face. Just a flat, blank composure that had been forged in sandstorms and firefights and decisions made at 3 a.m. with lives hanging on her judgment. I graduated summa cum laude, Dr. Caldwell, she said. Her voice was quiet, controlled, the tone of someone reporting facts. Is there something specific you need? He smiled then, the kind of smile that didn't involve the eyes, the kind of smile that made the nurses around her tense their shoulders. What I need is competent staff. Not whatever affirmative action hire the administrator forced on me. Then he knocked her tray from the table. One deliberate sweep of his arm, and the turkey sandwich scattered across the tile floor like shrapnel. The cup of juice upended, spreading a dark pool near her shoes. A bag of pretzels bounced twice and skated under another table. The room went absolutely silent, the kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electronic drone overhead, where 14 sets of eyes tracked the moment like a slow-motion video. Hannah didn't flinch. Didn't reach for napkins. Didn't say a word. Caldwell pulled a patient chart from under his arm, room 312, diabetic admission, and tossed it at her feet. The paper slid across the spilled juice, edges darkening as they absorbed the liquid. He stood over her, waiting for a reaction, waiting for her to break. She bent slowly. Not in shame. Not in submission. Just a controlled descent, the posture of someone performing a task that required no emotional investment whatsoever. She gathered the papers one by one, stacking them with meticulous care, her movements precise and unhurried. I'm giving her 1 week, Caldwell announced to the watching staff, his voice loud enough to fill the entire cafeteria. Anyone want to bet she quits before then? I've got $50 says she's gone by Monday. 3 doctors laughed. 2 of them pulled out their wallets. One of them, Dr. Hayes, the surgical resident, actually said, I'll take that action. She looks like she's already planning her resignation. Hannah continued gathering the ruined papers. The juice had soaked through completely now, making the chart pulpy and illegible. She carried them to the trash can near the entrance, deposited them carefully, and returned to the table to collect the scattered remnants of her lunch. A nurse named Patterson watched from 2 tables over, her expression caught between rage and helplessness. The sandwich pieces went into the trash. The pretzel bag followed. Hannah wiped her hands on a napkin, returned her tray to the rack, and walked out of the cafeteria without looking back at any of them. 40 minutes later, Nurse Patterson found her in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, standing motionless in front of a shelf of sterile gauze pads. The supply closet was barely larger than a closet should be, for walls of medical supplies, fluorescent light buzzing from a fixture that had never quite worked correctly. "Why didn't you say something?" Patterson whispered. The older nurse's voice shook slightly, caught between anger and sympathy. "He can't treat people like that. Not in front of everyone. Not like that." Hannah's hands were finally trembling now, but only because she was alone. Only because there were no witnesses and no mission parameters and no reason to maintain the mask for even one more second. She gripped the edge of the shelf with both hands, knuckles whitening. "I need this job," Hannah said. Her voice came out flat, emotionless, the way it sounded when she was about to make a difficult decision. "I need to be here." Patterson reached out to put a hand on her shoulder, and Hannah stepped forward with a movement that was half away, half evasion. Not unkind. Just a boundary drawn in space. "I'm okay," Hannah said. And it was technically true. She wasn't harmed. She wasn't broken. The trembling would stop when she left this room, would lock back down the way it always did. "Really? I'm fine." What she didn't say, "I need to stay close to room 347. I need to monitor Commander Reeves for signs of neurotoxin exposure. Naval Intelligence placed me here for a reason, and that reason is sleeping 2 floors below us on life support. I need Caldwell to underestimate me completely. I need him to think I'm what he told everyone I am, replaceable, incompetent, quitting material." Patterson lingered for another moment, then left quietly, her footsteps fading down the corridor. The trembling stopped exactly 90 seconds after Hannah was alone. The next morning, Dr. Caldwell cornered her at the nurse's station during the shift change at 7:43 a.m., that perfect moment when 6 staff members would be present but occupied with their own transitions, present enough to witness but distracted enough not to fully process what was happening. He held up a chart she'd filled out during her night shift, Commander Reeves's chart, actually, every line documented in her precise handwriting, every intake and output recorded, every vital sign notated at the exact time it had been taken. "I reviewed your charting from last night, sweetheart." He held the chart between them like evidence. Sloppy. Incomplete. Frankly embarrassing. Hannah's voice stayed level, the tone of someone discussing a medication dosage. "It's documented on page 3, sir. Line 17. He flipped to page 3, saw the entry in her handwriting, 200 hours, urine output 280 milliliters, and then smiled anyway. The smile was the worst part. It meant he hadn't cared about the chart. The chart was just a vehicle. The real point was the performance, the public establishment of hierarchy, the reminder that her competence didn't matter if his authority said it didn't. "Don't contradict me, sweetheart." His voice stayed quiet, almost conversational. "It makes you look defensive. Defensive nurses make mistakes. Mistakes kill patients." He tapped her shoulder with one finger, a gesture so deliberately condescending that it felt like a threat. "Maybe you should consider a career change before you hurt someone. Fast food is always hiring." Her hand gripped the counter edge so hard she could feel the laminate flex under her fingers. But her expression never changed. Her eyes stayed level. She said nothing as he walked away laughing, his white coat billowing slightly as he turned the corner toward the administrative offices. 30 seconds after he was gone, one of the junior nurses, a kid named Marcus, barely 25, still new enough to believe that hospitals operated on merit, leaned against the counter beside her. "That guy is a psychopath," Marcus said quietly. Hannah released her grip on the counter. Her hands were steady again. "I need some jello," she said. It wasn't what she meant to say, but it was what came out, and Marcus actually smiled a little at the absurdity of it. She clocked out at 7:58 a.m., 42 minutes before she was supposed to. The sunrise was coming through the east-facing windows of the parking garage, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. She sat in her car for 19 minutes without starting the engine, her tactical watch ticking away seconds that she couldn't get back, watching the morning shift arrive in ones and twos, their cars parked in neat rows like soldiers awaiting deployment. At 2:17 a.m. on her sixth night shift, everything changed. At 2:17 a.m. on her sixth night shift, the cardiac monitor in room 347 screamed. Hannah heard it from the nursing station, that particular shriek that meant electrical chaos, the sound of a heart forgetting how to beat. She was already moving before the second alarm sounded, muscle memory overriding thought. The fluorescent lights hummed their sickly fluorescent song as she pushed through the ICU doors, her sneakers silent on the tile. Commander Reeves's chest heaved once, twice, then nothing. His saturation plummeted. 89. 76. 68. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical complaint, struggling against the pressure building inside his chest cavity. Dr. Morrison, the on-call resident, stood frozen at the foot of the bed. 26 years old, 3 months into his first residency, and his face had gone the color of old milk. His hands trembled as he reached for the chart. Hannah had seen that look before, not in hospitals, but on forward operating bases when young soldiers realized they were in over their heads. The difference was that soldiers could call for air support. Morrison just stood there, staring at the monitor as Reeves's oxygen saturation continued its freefall. "We need a thoracotomy," Morrison whispered. His voice cracked like dry leather. "Should I call Caldwell?" Hannah was already pulling the ultrasound machine toward the bed. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, not in a sterile operating room, but in a sandstorm outside Bagram with artillery thundering in the distance and a SEAL officer bleeding out in the dirt. Her fingers flew across the ultrasound keyboard, the screen blooming with gray and black images. There it was. The pericardial effusion. Blood pooling around Reeves's heart like water around a drowning man, compressing the ventricles, strangling his cardiac output. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," Hannah said. Her voice had changed. The deferential new nurse was gone. What emerged was something else entirely, something that moved through the room like compressed air. And a 60-milliliter syringe. Sterile field. Now. Morrison's eyes snapped to her. "That's a pericardiocentesis. Only attending physicians. His heart rate is 38 and dropping. His blood pressure is 60 over nothing." Hannah's hands were already prepping Reeves's chest with betadine solution, the copper-brown antiseptic spreading across his pale skin like a battle map. "If we wait for Caldwell, he'll be dead in 4 minutes. Move." The resident moved. Hannah's tactical watch ticked, 2:19 a.m. 2:20 a.m. She located the fifth intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark where she'd done this before, where she'd saved a man's life in a firefight with nothing but a field needle and prayer. The needle went in. Smooth. Confident. The kind of motion that comes from muscle memory coded in bone. She felt the resistance change as the needle pierced the pericardial sac. And then the blood came. 200 milliliters of dark arterial red, drawn from around Reeves's failing heart. The syringe filled like she was drawing oil from the earth, like she was pulling life itself from the darkness. The moment the pressure released, Reeves's monitor changed its song. The heart rate climbed. 90. 100. 120. His oxygen saturation began its slow resurrection. 85. 91. 96. Sinus rhythm. Perfect, beautiful sinus rhythm, the electrical symphony of a heart remembering how to live. Morrison was shaking. His hand gripped the four-pole like it might disappear if he let go. Where did you learn? Hannah was already securing the needle, already checking Reeves's pupils, already verifying the monitor showed what it needed to show. His eyes fluttered. His breathing steadied. The morphine drip was keeping him under, keeping him sedated, keeping him from seeing the woman who'd crawled through hell to get him home and was now fighting to keep him alive in a hospital less than 2 miles from their base. She stepped back from the bed at 2:24 a.m. For minutes between death and breathing. "Call Caldwell," she said. "Tell him the situation is contained. Effusion has been drained." But she knew he wouldn't answer the phone in time. She'd done the math before she'd ever picked up that needle. Dr. Caldwell lived 40 minutes away in a Rittenhouse Square townhouse worth $1.8 million. Calling him now was just procedure. Just theater. Just following protocol so that no one could say the new night shift nurse had acted outside her scope. She'd already stepped outside her scope the moment she'd recognized Commander Reeves in this bed. She'd already blown her cover when she'd saved his life. By 6:22 a.m., when Hannah finally left St. Michael's and drove home in her 11-year-old Honda Civic, her hands had started shaking on the steering wheel. Not from the adrenaline that had burned off hours ago. They shook because she knew what was coming. The text from her naval intelligence handler confirmed it at a red light on Market Street. Status. She typed with thumbs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Emergency procedure performed. Identity may be compromised. The response came 3 minutes later, the way it always did when the Pentagon had a problem they needed solved quietly. Maintain civilian status. Do not reveal military connection under any circumstances. Investigation ongoing. Hannah pulled into her driveway as the morning sun hit the windshield, turning the glass into liquid gold. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She let herself in through the kitchen door and found her daughter Emma sitting at the breakfast table in her yellow school uniform, eating cereal with the concentration of someone solving a math problem. Emma looked up, and her face did that thing it always did when Hannah came home unexpectedly, lit up for exactly 1 second, then collapsed into understanding. 8 years old and already fluent in reading disappointment on her mother's face. "Mommy? Why are you home? You said you'd be at work until noon." Hannah tried to smile. Managed something that probably looked like a grimace. "Change of plans, baby. I get to have breakfast with you." Emma put down her spoon. The girl's eyes had the awareness of a child who'd watched her mother deploy twice, come home different both times, and learned never to trust the official story. "You got fired again, didn't you?" The words landed like shrapnel. Hannah sat down at the kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and copper blood and failure, and felt something crack inside her chest the way concrete cracks when the pressure gets too great. She pressed her palms against her eyes. The tears came before she could stop them, hot and angry, breaking through 16 months of a composure so rigid it had calcified into something barely human. Emma watched her mother cry with the horror of a child who'd never seen it before. "Mommy? Are you okay?" Hannah couldn't answer. Couldn't form words. All she could think about was Reeves in room 347, alone, with no one monitoring his vitals for signs of the experimental neurotoxin suspected in his injury, the same compound that had killed 2 other SEALs in the past 6 months. She'd been placed there to watch for it. That was her mission. That was the entire reason naval intelligence had put her in Philadelphia pretending to be a civilian nurse with a daughter and a mortgage and a normal life. And now she was home at 6:16 a.m. on a Thursday morning, crying at her kitchen table, and Reeves was unmonitored in a hospital bed with a doctor who had every reason to want him dead. Meanwhile, back at St. Michael's, Dr. Caldwell was making calls from his office with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent 18 months planning for exactly this scenario. His first call was to a private investigator named Vincent Reese, a man who'd worked for pharmaceutical companies doing background checks on whistleblowers for the past 12 years. His second call was to the state nursing board, filing a formal complaint citing Hannah Clarke for practicing beyond her scope of licensure, for performing an invasive procedure without physician supervision, for gross misconduct that endangered a patient. His third call was to the hospital's board of directors, specifically to board member Patricia Walsh, a woman whose son had received a kidney transplant that Caldwell had partially arranged through his pharmaceutical contacts. He didn't need to say much. Just, "We have a problem." A nurse performed a pericardiocentesis without authorization. The patient survived, but the legal exposure is significant. I recommend immediate termination. His fourth call was to his pharmaceutical supplier, confirming that their next kickback payment would arrive on schedule now that the threat was neutralized. Caldwell had no idea, none whatsoever, that Hannah Clarke's termination required her to provide complete employment history to the nursing board, which would trigger an automatic DOD security review of St. Michael's Hospital. He had no idea that the investigation he was launching was about to become a surgical instrument pointed directly at his own heart, waiting for someone to turn it and twist. He hung up the phone at 7:15 a.m., satisfied, and made himself a second coffee in the hospital physician's lounge, watching the morning news with the calm expression of a man who'd successfully eliminated a threat. But threats, Hannah had learned in Afghanistan, have a way of bouncing back. The steering wheel was slick under her palms. 6:30 in the morning, and the Philadelphia skyline blurred past the windshield as Hannah drove away from St. Michael's Hospital, still wearing the scrubs she'd changed into 16 hours ago. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the collision happening inside her skull between two identities. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Naval Special Warfare. And Hannah Clarke, RN, who'd just let a man with a bullet lodged near his spine recover in a hospital bed while she maintained cover. The mission parameters echoed in the silence of the car like a taunt. Monitor Reeves's condition for signs of neurotoxin exposure. Do not blow your identity. Maintain civilian cover at all costs. But the cost was bleeding out in real time. She pulled into her driveway at 6:45 and sat in the car for 5 minutes, hands gripping the wheel, breathing exercises learned in insertion zones doing nothing for the feeling that her chest was collapsing. She'd carried Reeves for 16 hours through Helmand Province with a bullet in her shoulder. She'd held his weight, his blood mixing with hers on the sand outside Sanjin. She'd earned his name tattooed on his arm through sacrifice that no classified briefing could quantify. And now she couldn't even tell him who she was. The house was quiet when she entered, Emma still asleep, thank God. Hannah moved through the kitchen like a ghost passing through solid matter, each step echoing off tile that suddenly felt too hard, too real, too civilian. She sat at the kitchen table at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, still in her scrubs, the termination letter folded in front of her like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. The official language was surgical, ineffective immediately, pending investigation by the State Board of Nursing into allegations of practicing beyond the scope of licensure. Dr. Caldwell's complaint details emergency procedures performed without proper authorization. Translation: a man had tried to kill her, and he'd succeeded. She was staring at the letter when Emma came home from school, backpack slung over one shoulder, lunchbox still in her hand. The girl stopped in the doorway, her 10-year-old brain processing the image, her mother at the kitchen table in hospital scrubs, crying. Not the quiet kind of crying. The kind that came from somewhere below the ribs. Emma's voice was small. "Mommy? Why are you home early? You said this job would be different. You said you wouldn't have to work nights anymore." Hannah couldn't move. Couldn't answer. The promises she'd made to Emma, the reason naval intelligence had placed her here, the anchor point for her cover, were collapsing in real time. This job had been supposed to be the fresh start. The place where Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke could pretend to be someone safe enough to raise a daughter who didn't know her mother had killed 7 people with her bare hands. Emma set down her lunchbox and wrapped her arms around Hannah's shoulders, which was somehow worse than any interrogation technique anyone at JSOC had ever devised. At 10 o'clock that night, Hannah returned to St. Michael's Hospital in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy blazer, her hair down instead of in regulation braid. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her cardboard box of personal items light enough to carry in one hand. Her locker had been emptied by hospital staff, everything that didn't belong to the institution already boxed up and waiting. She gathered the remaining items, a stethoscope she'd bought before her first day, a change of socks, the photographs Emma had drawn and taped inside the door. And underneath, wrapped in a plastic bag, the tarnished military challenge coin Commander Reeves had given her the night before everything shattered. The coin bore the insignia of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. On the reverse, an inscription, Angel of Bagram, 16 hours. We don't leave our own. She was closing the locker when the commotion started. Raised voices from the third floor. Security being called over the intercom. Someone screaming in a language that made Hannah's blood freeze to something colder than ice water. She took the stairs 2 at a time, box still in her hands, moving with the precision of someone who'd responded to combat situations before conscious thought could register fear. The ICU floor erupted into controlled chaos. Security guards in Navy uniforms surrounded a gurney being transferred into room 347, the patient straining against soft restraints while screaming in Pashto. The language hit Hannah like a physical blow, the same language she'd heard whispered across Phi Base Shank, the same dialect she'd learned to recognize as the voice of the men who'd shot her shoulder open. Hannah stopped in the doorway. The patient's eyes locked onto hers across the crowd of medical staff. His voice rose to a shriek, words tumbling over each other with the urgency of someone who'd just seen a ghost. Farishta Bagram. Farishta Bagram. Angel of Bagram. The code name resonated through the hallway like a funeral bell. Angel of Bagram, the name Taliban fighters had whispered about after she'd carried Commander Reeves 16 hours through hostile territory to an extraction point, the name she'd earned through suffering that couldn't be explained in a hospital corridor. Her hands went numb. The cardboard box slipped from her fingers and scattered across the tile floor, photographs of Emma spilling out like evidence of the civilian life that was about to explode. A Marine veteran named Marcus Webb stood near the security station, and Hannah watched recognition flare behind his eyes. He'd been briefed on combat operations. He'd seen the classified files. He stepped forward, his posture shifting to something military, something precise. He said quietly, voice low enough that only she could hear. He just called you by your code name. Angel of Bagram. I recognize it from intelligence briefings. Then louder, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, all personnel, stand down. I need you to identify yourself. This patient is a captured Taliban commander being extradited for trial, and he just recognized you from combat operations. The hallway went absolutely silent for 2 seconds. Then Dr. Caldwell emerged from the nurse's station, his face painted with triumph so vivid it was almost beautiful. He'd won. The investigation was coming. The new nurse was being escorted out by hospital security. Officer Webb, Caldwell said, voice smooth as oil, this woman was terminated this morning. She's trespassing. I'm calling police to remove her immediately. Webb didn't move. His hands remained at his sides, but something in his posture changed, spine straightening, chin lifting, the physical language of military bearing overriding civilian authority. Sir, with respect, I need her to verify her identity first. Protocol for foreign combatant recognition. The Taliban prisoner kept screaming, pointing at Hannah with both restrained hands, and Hannah felt every carefully constructed wall of her cover identity crumbling like sand in a desert wind. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical song, indifferent to the collapse of everything she'd built in this place. She could maintain her civilian pretense. She could walk away, let the investigation bury her deeper, let Reeves continue recovering without knowing who had saved him. Protocol demanded cover maintenance. Naval intelligence had made that explicit. But protocols were written by people who'd never carried their brothers through hostile fire. She straightened her spine, and muscle memory took over, 16 years of military bearing flooding back into her shoulders, her neck, the angle of her chin. The cardboard box lay forgotten on the floor, Emma's drawings scattered across the tile like discarded hopes. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, she said, voice dropping into the command register she'd trained into her bones. Naval Special Warfare. Service number 4477 to 2190. The hallway remained absolutely silent for 10 seconds. The heart monitor in room 347 beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical song. The Taliban prisoner continued his incomprehensible chanting. Then Webb's voice cut through like artillery fire. "All personnel, come to attention. You are in the presence of a Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy." 3 nurses straightened automatically, their military training overriding confusion. Dr. Caldwell laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed off tile like breaking glass. "This is absurd," he said, taking a step toward Hannah. "She's a nursing school graduate. Officer Webb, remove her from the premises immediately or I'll ensure you lose your commission." Webb didn't blink. He pulled out his phone and dialed with the precision of someone who knew exactly who to call. "This is Webb at St. Michael's Hospital in Philadelphia. I have a Master Chief whose cover has been compromised by foreign combatant recognition. I need senior officer arrival immediately." He hung up without waiting for confirmation and positioned himself directly between Caldwell and Hannah. The silence stretched like pulled steel, everyone waiting for something to break. It didn't take long. Hospital Administrator Tom Chen arrived running, confusion painted across his face like a mask. "What is this commotion? Dr. Caldwell, what's going on?" Someone called security about a termination dispute. The sound interrupted him before he could finish. Rotor wash thundered against the building's exterior, a sound Hannah had trained herself to recognize in her sleep, the distinctive pattern of a Navy Black Hawk helicopter landing on the hospital's rooftop helipad. The sound was followed by boots on tile, measured and precise, moving down the stairwell with military coordination. A 2-star admiral in dress uniform emerged into the hallway, flanked by 2 armed MPs whose bearing suggested they'd done this before. Rear Admiral James Porter, whose photograph hung in the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters building Hannah had visited exactly twice in her career, stopped directly in front of her and returned her salute with a slight nod. Then he turned to address the crowd of hospital staff now filling the hallway, nurses and doctors and orderlies all staring with expressions ranging from shock to pure confusion. "I am Rear Admiral James Porter, Naval Special Warfare Command," he said, his voice the kind that made people instinctively straighten their spines. "The woman you know as Hannah Clarke is Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. One of 12 female operators currently active in SEAL support operations." He pulled a tablet from his aide's hands and began reading, each line landing like something heavy, 3 bronze stars with Valor device. 1 silver star for gallantry. Navy Commendation Medal. Combat Action Ribbon. Caldwell's face went from triumphant to pale in the space of a heartbeat. 47 combat missions across 3 deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, the Admiral continued. Master Chief Clarke's code name, Angel of Bagram, was earned after she carried a wounded SEAL commander 16 hours through hostile territory to an extraction point under active fire, sustaining 2 gunshot wounds in the process. The hallway had gone so quiet Hannah could hear the rain outside, pounding against windows like applause. Security guard Webb stepped forward, his Marine bearing still evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. He held his phone out toward the assembled crowd, his voice steady and clear. "I need to tell you something." He turned to face the staff gathering in the hallway, his jaw tight. "I recognize you from the briefings. Naval intelligence briefings." The words landed like a detonation. Webb's voice dropped lower, more formal. "This is Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Naval Special Warfare Command." The hallway went absolutely still. Someone's hand slipped from a clipboard. A nurse 3 feet away took an involuntary step backward. Hospital Administrator Chen's face cycled through confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like comprehension of a building he'd been living in without knowing its true foundation. The elevator doors at the far end of the corridor hissed open. Admiral Porter emerged with 2 officers in dress uniforms trailing behind him like satellites around a gravity well. His 2-star rank insignia caught the fluorescent lighting. He moved toward the gathered crowd with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence. "Administrator Chen," Porter said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that required no volume to command attention. "We need to talk about Dr. Caldwell's employment file. Specifically, his access logs for the pharmaceutical supply room." Chen's mouth opened without sound. Porter gestured to his aide, who produced a tablet displaying documents that seemed to multiply across its screen like a deck of cards spreading. Master Chief Clarke was placed at this facility under Naval Intelligence clearance to monitor Commander Reeves's recovery from suspected neurotoxin exposure. During her assignment, she accessed pharmaceutical records as part of her nursing duties. Those same records show something interesting. The aide turned the tablet so Chen could see. Numbers. Dates. Times. A pattern that looked like someone had drawn a map of their own guilt in red pen. Dr. Caldwell has been systematizing pharmaceutical orders for 18 months. We're talking $1.2 million in inflated supply contracts, kickbacks routed through a medical supply company called Meridian Healthcare Solutions, and ICU billing manipulations that would make a forensic accountant weep. Porter's expression didn't change. It was the face of someone delivering a weather report about a hurricane. He implemented his system right after Master Chief Clarke arrived. When she began noticing discrepancies, he escalated his response from social intimidation to professional sabotage. He deliberately delayed responding to Commander Reeves's cardiac tamponade this week, hoping the patient would expire and the SEAL presence at this hospital would be eliminated before his fraud could be traced. Webb stepped closer to Dr. Caldwell, whose face had transformed into something the color of old pennies. I pulled the security footage from the pharmaceutical supply room, Webb said quietly. You went in there 47 times in the past 2 months. Always between 2 and 4 a.m. Always on nights you were supposedly off duty. The words came out like a prosecutor reading an indictment. Each one deliberate. Each one heavy. Caldwell's hands opened and closed. His mouth made shapes that didn't form words. Chen turned to him with the expression of someone who'd just discovered they'd been hiring a wolf to guard the sheep. Dr. Caldwell, you're suspended effective immediately. Pending criminal investigation. Security will escort you from the building. Caldwell's voice finally emerged, cracked and high. This is insane. I'm the head of this ICU. I've been here for 12 years. You're going to destroy my career over some accounting discrepancy. His eyes locked on Hannah like she was a target. Over a nurse who broke protocol? I saved this hospital millions in efficiency improvements. Hannah's voice cut through the hallway like a surgical blade through tissue. You knocked my lunch tray off a table in front of the entire cafeteria. You told me to pick it up, sweetheart. You bet $50 I'd quit within a week. She took one step toward him. Her posture absolute. Her eyes the color of winter Atlantic. You called me an affirmative action hire. You said I was too stupid for this work. You told me I should work in fast food instead. Caldwell's face went from pale to gray to something that looked like ash. Hannah's voice didn't rise. It only got colder. More importantly, you deliberately delayed responding when Commander Reeves went into cardiac tamponade. You had his page at 2:17 a.m. You didn't arrive until 2:59 a.m. 42 minutes. You were hoping he would die. You were hoping his death would clear this ICU of the SEAL presence that you knew threatened your fraud scheme. The words hung in the hallway like something solid and inerasable. Caldwell's hands gripped the wall behind him. His fingers looked like they were trying to push through solid concrete. I want to tell you something, Hannah continued, her Master Chief voice now completely visible, the one that had commanded 37 people through Helmand Province with nothing but composure and a radio. I performed a pericardiocentesis on Commander Reeves at 2:33 a.m., while you were still 15 minutes away. I drew 200 cubic centimeters of blood from around his heart. I restored his sinus rhythm. I saved his life while you were in your car calculating how much longer you could hide your theft before someone noticed. She pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her pocket. The one Reeves had pressed into her palm at his bedside 5 years ago in Bagram. The metal was discolored, worn smooth by 5 years of being carried through 3 deployments and 2 wars. You told me I was too stupid for nursing. You told me I should pick up my tray like a child. But I just watched a 2-star admiral read my service record to this entire hospital. She held up the coin so the light caught its scarred surface. 3 bronze stars. 1 silver star. 47 combat missions. And you're a man teaching CPR certification at a community college because you couldn't help yourself from stealing. Caldwell's voice broke like porcelain. I have a family. You can't do this to me. This is career suicide. Hannah's expression didn't flicker. You did this yourself. You're the one who filed the complaint that triggered the Naval Intelligence investigation. You're the one who manipulated the system so carefully that every single transaction points directly back to your authorization codes. You're the one who tried to kill a SEAL commander. She took the coin and placed it on the nearest desk, the metal making a soft sound against the laminate, a sound that seemed to echo down the hallway longer than physics should allow. You created the scalpel that cut your own throat. I just held it steady. Security arrived like a punctuation mark. 2 officers in grey uniforms took Caldwell's arms and began walking him toward the elevators. His protestations about injustice and career destruction faded into the distance like a siren passing in the night. The hospital staff stood motionless, watching him go. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence was so complete Hannah could hear the rain outside, hammering against the building's windows like applause from a crowd that would never know her name. 6 months later, the seasons had rotated and autumn had painted Philadelphia in reds and golds that looked like fire captured in leaves. Hannah walked into Delaware County Community College wearing civilian clothes, her Master Chief insignia now hanging openly on a chain around her neck, pressed against her chest like a talisman. She navigated corridors that smelled like institutional coffee and floor wax until she found room 107. The door was open. Inside, Dr. Richard Caldwell stood in front of 20 students, his medical license permanently revoked by the State Nursing Board, teaching basic CPR certification for minimum wage while his unemployment checks and divorce papers accumulated in a mailbox he barely checked anymore. Caldwell looked up from the mannequin he was demonstrating compressions on, and his face went the color of chalk. The class continued around them. Compressions. Release. Compressions. Release. None of the students noticed the woman who'd just entered, or the way their instructor's hands began to shake. Hannah didn't speak. She walked to his desk at the front of the classroom, her footsteps absolutely silent against the linoleum floor, and placed the tarnished challenge coin on top of his grade book. The same coin that had been pressed into her palm at a bedside in a military hospital 5 years ago, when Commander Reeves finally recognized her through the fog of medication and trauma and said her name like a prayer. The same coin she'd carried through 3 deployments. The same coin that represented 47 combat missions and the lives she'd saved and the men and women she'd lost. Caldwell stared at the coin like it was going to detonate. His mouth opened and closed. No sound emerged. Hannah leaned close enough that only he could hear. Commander Reeves made a full recovery. The neurotoxin investigation traced back to a Taliban cell operating outside Sanjan Valley. They targeted 3 SEAL commanders with experimental compounds. Because I stayed close, we identified the exposure pattern. 2 other operators survived because of what we found. She straightened. Her voice still barely a whisper. You told me to pick up my lunch tray. You tried to destroy my career. You tried to kill a wounded SEAL. Hannah tapped the coin once with the precision of a scalpel finding its target. I'm leaving this here so you remember something every single day you teach chest compressions. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. She turned and walked out of the classroom without looking back, her spine absolutely straight, her head high, leaving him staring at the coin. Behind her, she heard metal hitting linoleum, the sound of the coin dropping from trembling fingers and rolling across the floor like a judgment that would never stop moving. Outside, Commander James Reeves waited in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with his tattooed forearm clearly visible, her name still there after 5 years, after 2 wars, after everything. He was back on active duty. His eyes were clear. His hands were steady. How'd it go? He asked quietly. Hannah smiled for the first time in 6 months. Mission complete, sir. They drove away as autumn's sun painted the Philadelphia skyline gold and crimson, two warriors who'd saved each other's lives returning to the work that actually mattered, leaving Dr. Richard Caldwell to stand alone in a classroom, staring at a coin that represented everything he'd spent 18 months trying to steal. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been judged unfairly only to prove everyone wrong? Tell us your story. And hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories of the quiet warriors walking among us, the ones who save lives while the world sleeps.